We lived in the Dayton suburbs long enough that the routines felt permanent, the kind that convince people nothing important will ever change. Kettering on weekdays, Beaver Creek on Sundays. The same drive past Wright-Patterson where jets passed overhead often enough that no one looked up anymore. That was the backdrop of my family. Steady, predictable, and quietly tilted in one direction. Grant had always occupied the center of it. He lived 10 minutes away, close enough to be available, far enough to feel important. He hosted dinners in his remodeled kitchen with the granite island and the wine rack that never stayed full. I came when I could, usually straight from base, hair still tight, posture still squared, slipping back into civilian space like a guest who had overstayed somewhere else. The first time he called me our government employee, he did it with a smile, in front of cousins and an aunt who laughed too quickly, as if the joke needed help landing. "Our government employee is in town," he said, lifting his glass, the way someone might toast a mascot. I felt the heat rise and pass, the reflex to correct him still there. Then I let it go. I did not argue. I logged it. That was always my way. In the kitchen, my mother Linda stood near the sink, nodding along, and my father Tom sat at the table, hands folded, eyes down, the television murmuring in the background. The room smelled like roasted chicken and lemon cleaner. Nothing dramatic happened. That was the point. The comments stayed small, polished, easy to deny if challenged. When the talk turned to plans, Grant leaned back and said it must be hard to build a life when you are gone all the time, looking at me like he was doing me a favor by acknowledging the sacrifice. Mom followed with something softer, but sharper. "A girl should think about being closer to home," she said, meaning stable, meaning visible, meaning under her eye. Dad did not say a word. His silence landed heavier than either of theirs, because he was the one who had once told me service mattered, who had driven me to my first physical with a paper cup of bad coffee and pride he did not hide. Watching him look through me felt like being demoted without paperwork. Later, in the garage, Grant pulled out a folder from a cabinet and started talking about repairs and taxes as if he were already in charge. He did not ask my opinion. He explained it to me, like a briefing he expected me to receive and execute. When I mentioned a detail, he waved it off. "I will have Halpern take care of it," he said, as if the name alone closed the subject. They call it leadership. It is control. The pattern repeated in smaller places. In the church parking lot after Sunday service, while people hugged and promised lunch dates, Grant spoke to a neighbor about managing things for our parents because someone had to be responsible. He said it loud enough for me to hear. Mom nodded, smoothing her coat. Dad stared at the asphalt. I stood there with my hands clasped behind my back, a habit I had not broken, and counted breaths. I kept noticing how decisions were made in my presence without me, how my role had been quietly reassigned to witness. At night, I sat at the small table in my rental and scrolled past messages I did not answer. There was a secure folder on my phone I never opened in front of anyone. Not because it was secret in the dramatic sense, but because it belonged to a different lane of my life, one that did not intersect with dinner jokes or polite dismissals. Once, while Grant was mid-sentence about insurance, my phone buzzed. I stepped away, answered, and said only, "Yes, sir, understood," then put it away. Grant raised an eyebrow and smirked. "Must be nice," he said, and I let that sit too. The injustice was not a single blow. It was cumulative. Each remark pressed a thumb on a scale already tipped. Each decision made without me reinforced the story that I was temporary, unreliable, an accessory. I watched the way Grant spoke to clerks and neighbors, how he practiced being deferred to, and I recognized the confidence of someone who had never been challenged by a system that did not care who he was. The worst moment was not loud. It was a Tuesday evening in Beaver Creek when Mom mentioned paperwork and Grant answered for her, outlining next steps, assigning calls, and thanking me for understanding without waiting for a response. Dad cleared his throat and said nothing. I realized then that asking for a seat at this table would only confirm their belief that I did not belong at it. I swallowed the urge to correct the record and let them keep telling their version. Because there is a difference between being ignored and being prepared. By the time Grant called Halpern and said he would handle things, the boundary had been crossed. That was the injustice that stuck. Not the joke, not the advice, but the assumption that my consent was optional. What do you think a family owes you? Money or the minimum respect of being asked? My father died in March 2023, early spring in Ohio, when the snow has mostly given up, but the ground still feels hard under your feet. The call came on a Tuesday morning while I was off duty, and by the time I pulled into Kettering, the house already felt rearranged. Chairs moved, voices lowered, decisions happening without a meeting. Dad had been many things in his life. A husband who did not talk much, a father who believed in showing up early, and before all of that, a man who had served part-time in the Army Reserve and later worked as a civilian contractor for the Department of Defense. That part of his life rarely came up at family dinners because it was not flashy, and it did not make anyone feel important in conversation. It did matter, though, and it mattered in a way most people never notice until they need to. The funeral was held that weekend, a simple service with folded programs and polite hugs. Grant stood at the front and read something he had written the night before, words about responsibility and family and moving forward. People nodded. I stood off to the side near the aisle, watching how easily tone becomes authority when no one interrupts it. When the service ended and people began to drift toward the parking lot, Grant leaned close and said quietly that we should settle assets quickly so everyone could heal. He said it the way people say practical things they believe should not be questioned. It landed wrong. Not because it was rude, but because it was premature. People my parents' age hate that moment when grief is treated like a transaction, and I saw it on a few faces before they looked away. Later that afternoon, in the kitchen, Grant started talking about inheritance as if it were a category he could define on his own. Dad would not want paperwork drama, he said. He would want closure. I remember thinking that he meant closure the way a contract closes. Signatures aligned, numbers final, the mess boxed and labeled. That was not how my father used the word. Closure to him had always meant getting the record right, even if it took longer than anyone liked. 2 days after the funeral, I went into the garage to sort through what Dad had kept. The practical things, the labeled bins, the shelf he had insisted on organizing himself even after his hands shook. I noticed something was missing almost immediately. There had always been a thin binder and a small metal box he kept on the top shelf. Not locked, not hidden, but never touched by anyone else. The binder held copies of old memoranda, correspondence tied to a line of duty clarification from years back, and a final determination memo that never made it into the family story. The box held the folded flag from his reserve years, and a few documents that established custody and reporting chain. They were gone. I did not ask out loud at first. I waited until Grant walked in and started talking about donation runs and schedules. When I asked him where the binder was, he did not hesitate. "I already took care of it," he said, like you would say you paid a bill. My chest tightened. That was the wrong answer. Not because he had moved something, but because those items were not personal property in the way he understood property. They were tied to a responsibility, a requirement to submit and correct a record that had been mishandled long before I ever joined. I could hear Dad in my head, explaining the difference between owning something and being trusted with it. Grant did not see the difference and did not care to learn it. Over the next week, he continued to frame inheritance as money and control, listing what he thought mattered: accounts, the house, the car, the timing. I listened and said very little. Inside, I felt the shift from suspicion to clarity. This was not about assets. It was about custody of a record that still had weight because of how the military handles accountability. The final determination memo Dad had kept referenced a reporting chain error that affected another family, an honor misapplied, a line that had never been corrected because it was inconvenient. The inheritance was not cash. It was the obligation to submit that record through the proper channel so it could be corrected. Grant treated that obligation like clutter. That night, I sat in my car outside the base and stared at the dashboard longer than necessary. I knew exactly who to call in the base legal office, a JAG liaison whose name was not public and whose role existed for moments like this. I knew the protocol for custody, how records like that move, who is authorized to hold them, and what happens when they are mishandled. I did not make the call. Timing matters. The wrong call at the wrong moment turns responsibility into noise. Instead, I waited and watched as Grant continued to talk about closure and speed, unaware that he was narrowing his options. When he told me again that Dad would not want drama, I thought about how often drama is used to rush past truth. Standing in the garage, looking at the empty space on the shelf, I felt the full weight of what had been taken. Not money, not leverage, but a duty. That was the moment doubt gave way to resolve. If someone you love leaves behind something no one wants to talk about, do you dig until it hurts, or do you leave it buried? The morning of the hearing arrived gray and ordinary, which felt fitting because this was the kind of day where life changes without ceremony. Montgomery County Probate Court sits downtown like a building that has seen too many arguments to care about any single one. And when I walked through the doors, I felt the familiar tightening in my shoulders that comes from entering a space ruled by procedure. The first stop was the security checkpoint. Shoes on the floor markers, belt in the tray, keys clinking into plastic bins, the metal detector chirping at someone behind me who had forgotten the watch. The guard waved me through without comment. Past that, a clerk sat behind glass handing out docket lists printed on thin paper. I scanned the names and saw ours halfway down, neat black type that flattened months of tension into a single line. Grant was already there. Of course he was. He stood near the counter, laughing softly with the clerk, hand resting easily on the edge, as if this were an office he visited often. He shook her hand when she passed him a file and thanked her by name, the practiced ease of someone who believes familiarity is a form of leverage. I did not acknowledge him. I took a seat on the wooden bench, back straight, hands folded loosely in my lap, eyes moving through the room the way training teaches you to read spaces before people. When the bailiff called our case, his voice cut through the low murmur, and we stood. Grant stepped forward first, confident, already in motion, and I followed a half step behind. The courtroom itself was smaller than television makes them seem. Rows of benches, the seal on the wall, Judge Haskins above us, expression neutral, glasses low on his nose. Mr. Halpern rose smoothly and introduced himself, his tone calm and reassuring, the kind that sounds reasonable even when it is narrowing options. He referred to Grant as the responsible party, repeating the phrase as if it were a title earned rather than claimed. He described me as uncooperative, someone who had been difficult to reach and slow to respond. Grant nodded along and added that I was emotional, a word delivered gently but with purpose. That word landed the way it always does. Not wrong, unstable. I felt the familiar burn and let it pass. They do not call you wrong when they want control. They call you unstable, Halpern continued, noting my schedule, how I was gone all the time, how it would be impractical for someone with my commitments to manage anything ongoing. Grant picked up the thread easily. "She is rarely home," he said, palms open, as if appealing to common sense. How can she manage anything? It was almost impressive how service to the country was reframed as a liability without raising voices. I listened, jaw relaxed, eyes steady, absorbing the cadence of their argument. Judge Haskins looked down at the file, then up at me. "Do you object?" he asked, voice even. I stood. I did not rush. I said 2 words. "I object." I kept my hands still on the table, shoulders square, weight balanced evenly on my feet. I had learned long ago that composure is not passivity. It is discipline. Halpern smiled faintly and asked on what grounds. The room felt smaller. I took a breath and said, "We are missing the full record." Judge Haskins paused. "What record?" he asked. "The one you have not been allowed to see yet," I said. Grant let out a short laugh before he could stop himself, and then apologized, saying this was unnecessary, that everything relevant was already in the file. His confidence wavered for the first time, just enough to notice. Judge Haskins leaned back slightly and studied me. He asked if I was suggesting there were materials outside the scope of the court. I said yes, and that their custody was not a matter of preference. The temperature in the room shifted. Halpern objected, saying there was no evidence of that this was a simple inheritance matter. Grant added that my work had given me a habit of seeing complications where none existed. The military card was being played against me with care, turned into a suggestion of paranoia rather than professionalism. I felt the pressure rise, the urge to explain, to educate, to prove. I did none of that. I kept my eyes on the judge. The bailiff shifted his weight. Judge Haskins asked if I had anything further to add. I said only that the court would want the complete picture before proceeding, and that I was asking for a brief pause. The room went quiet, in the way rooms do when everyone senses a hinge. Grant leaned toward his attorney and whispered. Halpern straightened his papers. Judge Haskins tapped a pen against the desk once and said we would take a moment. He looked at Grant and then at me. He said he did not appreciate being rushed. The words were not loud, but they carried. Grant tried to recover, explaining again that speed would bring closure. Closure, he repeated, as if repetition made it truer. I thought of my father and how he used that word when he meant accuracy, not convenience. Judge Haskins asked the bailiff to check something and glanced at the clock. My heart beat steady. I did not look at Grant. I watched the door at the side of the room, the one people use when they are not part of the audience. This was the moment where silence either collapses or holds. I stood in it. When Judge Haskins looked back at me, his expression had changed from neutral to curious. He asked me to clarify what I meant by not allowed to see. I said there were materials subject to federal custody and that their presence would clarify jurisdiction. Halpern started to object again and stopped himself when the judge raised a hand. The room felt tight, expectant, every small movement amplified. Grant shifted from foot to foot, the ease gone from his posture. This was not how he expected authority to behave. It was not loud or friendly. It was procedural and slow. Judge Haskins said he would wait. The word hung in the air. In a courtroom built on momentum, waiting is power. I stayed still and let it work. If you were sitting there, watching, who would you trust? The person speaking smoothly or the one standing quietly and sure? The side door opened with a clean push that did not announce itself. No dramatic swing, no pause for effect, just the controlled movement of someone who expected the room to make space. I noticed it a fraction of a second before anyone else did, not because I was looking for a savior, but because certain details register automatically when you have spent years tracking schedules and movements that never appear on public calendars. The timing matched what I had already been briefed on that morning, and my breathing slowed instead of quickening. The bailiff straightened first, then the clerk behind him. Chairs scraped as people stood almost in unison, an instinct older than thought. Grant rose last, confusion flashing across his face as he followed the motion without understanding it. The man who entered wore a plain uniform with 4 stars that did not need explanation. His posture economical, his expression neutral. He did not look at me. He did not look at Grant. He walked to the space beside the bench and waited. The room settled into a silence that felt different from before. Heavier, more deliberate. Judge Haskins adjusted his glasses and stood. The general spoke one sentence, his voice level, not raised, not lowered. "I am here to confirm jurisdiction and protect a federal record from being misassigned." That was it. No story, no accusation, no hint of favor. Just a statement of scope. Grant let out a small breath that sounded like a laugh and tried to recover his footing. "This is unnecessary," he said, glancing at his attorney as if to anchor himself. Judge Haskins did not look at him. "Sit down," he said, and the word landed with finality. Halpern shifted his papers and opened his mouth, then closed it when the judge raised a hand. The general remained standing, hands clasped loosely, eyes forward. A phone vibrated on the bench, and the judge glanced at it, reading briefly, then nodded. He said that the court had received confirmation from the base command group that the matter before them involved materials under federal custody, and that the court would not proceed as if it were a simple probate dispute. The shift was immediate. Grant went from petitioner to participant, touching something he did not own. The confidence drained from his posture, replaced by the rigid stillness of someone waiting for instructions that were not coming. The judge addressed the room, explaining that when jurisdiction is misapplied, the risk is not delay, but damage, and that procedure exists to prevent exactly this kind of error. He asked for the custody order to be entered into the record. The clerk complied. Papers moved, pens scratched. No one raised their voice. The exposure was public and complete, without being cruel. Grant tried once more to smile, to signal reasonableness, but it did not reach anyone. Judge Haskins looked at him directly then, not with anger, but with distance. He said that the court would pause proceedings until the proper record was presented through the appropriate channel, and that any further handling of the materials without authorization would be ill-advised. Grant nodded too quickly. Halpern leaned close and whispered, the tone urgent now. The general remained still, a reminder that this was not about personalities. It was about boundaries. I stood where I was, hands still, heart steady. There was no satisfaction in watching someone lose control of a story they thought they owned. There was only the clarity that comes when a system asserts itself. Judge Haskins thanked the general for the clarification and indicated that the court would recess briefly. The general acknowledged him and turned toward the door. As he passed, the room stayed standing until he was gone, an automatic response no one questioned. When the door closed, the air felt thinner. Grant exhaled hard and rubbed his hands together as if warming them. He looked at me then, searching for an explanation he had already forfeited the right to receive. I did not give him one. The judge gathered the file and spoke to the clerk, his tone businesslike, already moving on to the next item on the docket. The exposure was complete, not because someone had been shamed, but because the story had shifted out of private hands and into the open, where control does not belong to confidence. There is nothing more unsettling than realizing you no longer decide how the room reacts. Do you think real power is money? Or is it the moment when an entire room stands without being told? When the court came back on the record, The energy in the room had changed from tension to focus, the kind that follows clarity. Judge Haskins addressed the matter with the calm precision of someone who had seen confidence dissolve before and knew how to proceed without feeding it. He asked for confirmation of authority and scope, and the general responded without embellishment. Before anyone spoke my name, I acknowledged him with a brief nod and a form of address that did not draw attention to itself. The kind used when rank is understood and familiarity is procedural rather than personal. It passed unnoticed by most, but not by the people trained to notice such things. The general glanced in my direction for the first time, just long enough to confirm alignment, then turned back to the judge. "We have reviewed her credentials," he said, and the sentence landed with a weight that had nothing to do with tone. Grant stiffened. Halpern shifted again, the smoothness gone from his movements. Judge Haskins asked for clarification, and the general explained that the materials at issue were part of an after-action review and a line-of-duty determination memo connected to a reporting chain error that had never been fully resolved. He stated that the documents included a chain of custody log establishing federal responsibility and that mishandling them as personal property would be inappropriate. The word inappropriate did more work than accusation ever could. The judge nodded and asked who held custodial authority. The general did not hesitate. He said the responsibility had been formally assigned and that the court had been provided with the documentation to that effect. He looked at me then and stated my name. Grant reacted audibly this time, a sharp intake he could not control. Halpern stood as if to object, and stopped when Judge Haskins raised a hand. The judge asked me to confirm my role. I did not elaborate. I said that I had been appointed as custodian for the record under the applicable protocol, and that my clearance covered review submission and correction. No acronyms were necessary. The room understood enough. The reveal was not dramatic. It was administrative, which made it final. Judge Haskins leaned forward and asked when the binder had last been in authorized custody. I answered honestly, stating that it had been removed without consultation. Grant shook his head and tried to speak. Halpern put a hand on his arm too late. Grant said he had taken it to handle paperwork, and that there had been no harm intended. Judge Haskins asked where it was now. Grant hesitated. The pause stretched. He said he had filed it as property pending valuation. The word valuation drew a reaction from the judge that was not anger, but disappointment. "This is not inheritance money," he said. "This is a federal record." The distinction seemed to collapse something in Grant. His voice rose as he tried to explain that he was protecting the family, that he was managing things responsibly. The composure he had relied on slipped. He spoke too quickly, contradicted himself, reached for arguments that no longer applied. For the first time, he was not steering the conversation. Judge Haskins addressed him directly, explaining that attempting to treat custodial materials as assets could expose him to consequences he did not appear to have considered. The judge ordered that the binder and any related materials be returned immediately, and that no further handling occur outside authorized channels. He asked the clerk to note the instruction. The general confirmed the process and stated that the purpose of correcting the record was to ensure that another family received proper honor that had been delayed by the original reporting error. That sentence changed the moral center of the room. This was no longer about who got what. It was about restoring accuracy to something that mattered beyond us. Grant fell silent. His shoulders slumped, as if the effort of maintaining authority had finally exhausted him. Judge Haskins summarized the matter for the record, stating that the court would defer to federal jurisdiction, that proceedings would be paused pending proper submission, and that any attempt to monetize or leverage the materials would be viewed unfavorably. He looked at Grant and said that there are things you cannot inherit with a lawyer. You have to be worthy of them. The line echoed in the quiet that followed. I thought back to the opening moment, to the belief that everything could be bought if the price was right. The mistake my brother made was not procedural. It was conceptual. He assumed all power functioned like money. The general acknowledged the court and prepared to leave. As he did, Judge Haskins thanked him again and noted that the court appreciated clarity. When the door closed, Grant looked at me with something like disbelief, as if he were trying to reconcile the version of me he had dismissed with the reality now fixed in the record. I did not look away, but I did not explain. The truth had already done its work. The only mistake my brother made was believing everything could be bought. And now, everyone in that room understood exactly why he was wrong. The consequences arrived without drama, the way systems work when they finally align. Judge Haskins summarized the posture of the case in plain language and ordered the petition paused pending federal submission, his tone even and uninterested in argument. He made it clear that the court would not proceed on an inheritance theory while jurisdiction remained elsewhere, and that any attempt to press the issue would be dismissed outright. Halpern nodded and gathered his papers, the efficiency returning now that persuasion was no longer useful. Grant stood beside him, hands empty, eyes unfocused, as if the room had rotated slightly and he was recalibrating. The judge addressed him directly and issued a warning that was precise rather than theatrical, stating that the improper handling of a federal record could carry consequences beyond this courtroom if repeated. He did not threaten. He did not lecture. He simply noted the boundary and moved on. The clerk read the orders into the record: return of materials, no contact with custodial documents, compliance with chain of custody protocols, and a pause on proceedings until proper submission occurred. Pens moved, pages turned. The bailiff nodded once. That was the humiliation. Not the kind that draws blood, but the kind that removes oxygen. Grant did not argue. He did not protest. He stood there like someone who had lost his internal map, posture rigid, eyes scanning for cues that no longer applied. No one raised their voice at him. No one needed to. Procedure did the work. Judge Haskins asked if there were any questions. Halpern said no. Grant opened his mouth and closed it. The judge thanked the court staff and adjourned. The gavel tapped lightly, and it was over. In the quiet that followed, people gathered their belongings with the small efficiency of those who have other matters to attend to. I remained still until the room began to clear, letting the moment pass without claiming it. Grant stepped aside to let others through, the instinctive deference of someone who had just learned where he stood. Outside the courtroom, in the corridor with its worn carpet and muted signs, Halpern spoke to Grant in a low voice, outlining next steps that were no longer strategic, just procedural. Grant nodded and rubbed his hands together as if cold, then looked up and met my eyes for a second. There was no anger there, only a question he did not ask. I did not answer it. The clerk approached and asked me to confirm contact information for the return of materials. I did, and thanked her. She nodded, professional, already moving on. That was how the system acknowledged me. Not with applause, but with a checkbox completed. As we filed out, Grant lagged behind, watching people pass as if he were trying to read their faces for judgment. There was none. That is what makes this kind of consequence so difficult to bear. It offers no spectacle to push against, no villain to blame. It simply reorders the world and leaves you standing where you are. Outside, the day had not changed. Traffic moved, phones buzzed, someone laughed near the elevator. Grant stopped near the wall and stared at the floor, shoulders slightly hunched. A man accustomed to directing, now waiting for instructions that would not come. I walked past him without stopping, not because I wanted to hurt him, but because the order was clear, and distance was part of it. The satisfaction was quiet and clean. No one cheered. No one scolded. The court did what it was designed to do, when records are in the right place. Do you believe that sometimes justice does not need shouting? It just needs the file where it belongs. 3 weeks passed before Grant reached out, the kind of pause that feels calculated rather than reflective. It was late afternoon when he showed up. Not at my door exactly, but at the edge of the driveway where he could still pretend this was a casual visit. The sun was low and the neighborhood was quiet, the ordinary sounds of someone mowing a lawn down the block and a car door closing nearby. He did not look like a man coming to apologize. He looked like a man arriving with a revised pitch. He started talking before I had fully stepped outside, saying he had been thinking a lot about family and how everything had gotten out of hand. He said he had only been trying to protect us, to keep things simple, to do what Dad would have wanted. The words were familiar, rearranged but not new. He mentioned stress and misunderstandings, and said the system had embarrassed him more than necessary. He asked if I could help smooth things over, just clarify a few points, explain it in a way that would quiet the rumors. I listened without interrupting, arms relaxed at my sides, weight even on my feet. When he finished, he waited, eyes searching for the version of me that used to fill silence for other people. I did not give it to him. I said one sentence and let it stand. I cannot help you rewrite a record. He blinked and tried again, saying he deserved some respect after everything he had done for the family. I answered with the other sentence I had practiced and never raised my voice. You do not get to ask for respect after you tried to erase me. That was it. No argument, no explanation. I stepped back and closed the door. A few weeks later, I saw him again in the church parking lot, after a service I rarely attend. His posture tense, his smile thin. He spoke to people in lowered tones now, explaining, justifying, negotiating. The story had moved without him. The business circle he relied on values predictability, and procedure had outed him in a way gossip never could. Invitations slowed. Calls went unanswered. Not because anyone was angry, but because uncertainty is contagious, and no one wants it near their name. At home, Mom called more often, her voice soft with concern that always drifted toward pressure. She suggested I be the bigger person, that families move on, that I remember how hard this had been for her. I listened and set a boundary without dressing it up. I told her I was not available for mediation or messaging. She tried again the following week, changing tactics, asking for updates, implying obligation. I said no again, and meant it. Distance is not punishment. It is clarity. Grant sent one more message, shorter this time, asking if there was anything at all I could do. I did not respond. The consequence was not dramatic. It was social and steady. His credibility thinned. Mine did not need to grow for that to happen. Systems remember, even when people pretend they do not. Standing in my driveway that first afternoon, I had felt no triumph, only relief that I no longer had to perform patience for someone who treated it like weakness. Toxic people do not apologize. They negotiate. And when negotiation fails, they move on to the next person who might listen. The work finished quietly, the way it should. I returned the binder and the metal box through the proper channel, logged, signed, verified. Each step recorded without commentary. The chain of custody closed the way a clean sentence ends, with nothing extra hanging off the edge. There was no announcement, no acknowledgement beyond a confirmation receipt and a short message that the submission had been received and reviewed. That was enough. I did not tell anyone what I had done. I did not explain the process to friends or family. I did not correct the versions that continued to circulate in small conversations where people prefer comfort to accuracy. Peace does not come from being understood by everyone. It comes from knowing you did the right thing when it mattered. Life returned to its ordinary shape. Mornings at base, evenings that ended early. a house that felt like mine again because I no longer carried unfinished arguments into it. I noticed that my shoulders stayed lower, that I slept through the night without replaying conversations I wished I had handled differently. Healing was not dramatic. It was cumulative. The dignity came from restraint, from letting systems do what they are designed to do, without turning justice into a performance. I thought about my father often, about the way he believed accuracy was a form of respect, and how he would have appreciated that the record now reflected the truth without spectacle. Families have a way of teaching us what we are willing to tolerate. Mine taught me the cost of silence when it is mistaken for consent. Standing alone is not the same as being lonely when you are standing in the right place. Some families inherit money. Others inherit silence. I chose neither. If you were Bexley, would you choose quiet to keep the peace, or choose the truth, even if it meant standing by yourself?